All right, welcome everybody back to another episode of the Big Doug and Carmi Show. Draft's all wrapped up. We're here to check out all the ins and outs of it. To do that, good buddy of the show, Kevin Sheehan, is joining us today. Kevin, how are you?
Boys, I can see you. I know you can't see me. I don't know what happened, but we'll do this anyway. Look, really good to see both of you.
Absolutely. Yes, we promised the viewers Kevin's there. Technical difficulties, you know how it works.
Yeah, I
Listen,
didn't have time to put my makeup on, so
Exactly
I
right.
made sure that you couldn't see me. Looking is terrible.
fantastic. Kevin, we're I guess at the end of phase one, if you will, in the first year of what has been a monumental year for the organization. Where does this last 6 months stack up with some of the other major changes we've seen for the organization over time?
Well, I mean, the easy answer for all of us, and it's the right answer, is we have the first off season without Dan Snyder owning the team 25 years. So we have a chance. I know that that's overly simplistic and it gets beat into the ground over and over again, but that's just what it is. I mean, it's a real organization without a meddlesome bad guy, terrible, decision making owner. The owner has, shorted all of us for a quarter century, and now we don't have that working against us. So there's a chance here. Now, with respect to, that aside, they hired, I think, the number one GM that was on the market. He's never been a full-time GM, but he certainly has been a solid talent evaluator. We made the decision to go with a traditional structure, an actual general manager who then is involved in hiring the coach, and then the coach will coach the team, and the coach is Dan Quinn, and I actually like the hire. And we've gone through free agency where that coach, really more than anybody else in the organization, because of his long-standing relationships and the respect that he's garnered over a long period of time, was able to attract a lot of players that perhaps would not have picked here, certainly not under the old ownership, but maybe even under the new ownership and new front office if you had a first-time coach. So, they didn't kill it in free agency from a spending big money or big star player, but I liked the process. And then we just finished the draft, in which you can't tell anything about a draft right now, but they did draft the player that was my favorite player in the draft at number 2 overall. So I'm excited about that. So it's a functioning organization in a league that sort of requires adults to manage it, and we haven't had that for a long period of time. So I'm looking forward to whatever the future brings, because we know it couldn't be what it was before, and so far so good in the evaluation of what these guys have done, but they haven't played a game yet.
Kevin, I know that you're a big JD5 fan. Of course, we're going to get into all that, but I got to say, your conversation before the draft with Eric Eager was one of my favorite. First of all, the two of you are some of my favorites, you know that. But you bringing up EPA versus pressure to sack, because the amount of times that Daniels would run out of bounds short, and then the accrued investment on those plays, I thought was fantastic. I hope you'll go into a little bit about what you were talking about there.
Well, I think, for me, I like all the information, but I'm a massive college football fan. And I think sometimes, we get a lot of people, evaluating that are just looking at numbers and looking at analytics and looking at information. And, even the guys that study the tape sometimes miss something from the context of what the game meant, what the game situation was, what the crowd was like, what the, all that stuff. I watched every single one of his games. And so when they talked about pressure to sack percentage being a major problem with him, I'm like, really? So I went back and I looked at, all of his years, including Arizona State years where it was really bad. And look, there was context around it. First of all, the yards lost per sack for him compared to the other quarterbacks was much lower. Actually, he and Drake May had the lowest average yards per sack in lost yardage. Like Caleb and JJ McCarthy, were 6, 7, or close to 8 yards per sack, whereas Jayden was like barely 4 yards per sack. And it kind of matched up with what I thought, which is here's a guy that's always creating, always trying to make a play. And it's not like the traditional sack where he drops back, he's under pressure, his eyes go towards the pressure, and he's down 9 yards behind the line of scrimmage. You saw some of that because, eventually they started to blitz him and you had some of those, but you had a lot of those where he was minimizing the yards lost. So it wasn't 2nd and 19, it was 2nd and 12 or 2nd and 13. And I just think there's context. Not all sacks are alike. Some of them were plays where he scrambled after being in the pocket, and maybe he ran out of bounds 2 or 3 yards short of the line of scrimmage instead of chucking it downfield into traffic. Now, you could say that's a bad decision. He should throw an incomplete pass. But and then the third down numbers were the ones that were – the intermediate throws were the ones where I'm like, that's interesting because he did take more outside the numbers shots from my memory. But what really stood out, and I think this is even more context than even the pressure to sack percentage, is people had a problem with his lack of intermediate throws. Well, they faced the fewest third downs of any team in the country. And when do you see a lot of the intermediate throws? Well, you see a lot of throws on third down to begin with. And a lot of those at 3rd and 5, 3rd and 7, 3rd and 9 are intermediate throws. Well, they faced the fewest by far third downs of any team in the country. And what was interesting is when they did face third down, they were the number 1 third down conversion team in the country too. So I just think there's always context around those things. And I would have never looked into the context if I didn't think from watching him that it seemed a bit off. But it's not like he didn't take sacks. But that number, by the way, also got much better as he grew. And then here's just one last piece of context with him. And I've seen Orlovsky tweet this out in recent days. If you watched LSU, they couldn't afford to punt. Their defense was horrendous. And so he knew that. Part of the context was, I better make a play here, and we better stay on the field, even if it means taking more risk. Because if I send my punt team out there, they're going to score another 7. He had to score 35 to 40 in every game just to have a chance to win. They gave up 47.5 points on average in the 3 losses they had. So I just love the player. So you can always go back and find numbers and find context to fit your belief, whatever it is. But I thought the intermediate throw in particular gripe was easily explained. And I think pressure to sack percentage, even if you think it's a problem, it got better, and the yards lost per sack were the lowest of any of the quarterbacks we were talking about.
Gotcha. So, Kevin, clearly you're a big fan of Jayden Daniels, and I agree with you. I do think he's a high upside quarterback, franchise quarterback. I'm just curious of your overall thoughts on the draft as a whole. You got Johnny Newton early in the 2nd round. Mike Sanders still as a defensive back. It seemed like we did not address the left tackle position. I was curious if that is a concern for you or just happy with the draft altogether. Just kind of curious of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the first thing is that, when you go back and you look at drafts in previous years, our reactions to these drafts, and then you fast forward 3 years and we're wrong more than even the teams are wrong, and they're wrong 65% of the time. So it's kind of a silly game to try to evaluate or grade drafts because you just don't know. But in terms of getting players at, a spot that was perceived value versus, reach, they did pretty well. They certainly did well with Johnny Newton. That was a projected 1st rounder. A lot of people feel they did well with Sanders-Strill, who, if you watched college football, what a big factor he was for Michigan's defense. Sinnott, watch him. He looks like Cooley, by the way.
He does. He looks like 100%.
Yeah, and Cooley's doing a film breakdown of him, and I think I'm going to have that on my podcast tomorrow, or Friday, because I told him that he looks like you, and he said, "Well, there's no way he's as good as me." And I said,
"Good answer."
You don't know that yet. These guys are much better athletes, and they're much more committed than you were. Yeah, and then Brandon Coleman's the interesting one because they may have gotten value there. And what you saw in their draft was an emphasis on athleticism. I had the guy that created that, relative athletic score, RAS, on the radio show yesterday. It's very interesting stuff. I said, what are the positions where it typically proves out to be important that they were athletic? And he said, O-line, he said pass rusher, O-line, and tight end. He said every great tight end in the game tested very high in the raw athletic score, and Sinnott, graded out very highly, and Brandon Coleman did as well. So those are encouraging things as it relates to the athleticism. We'll see whether or not they can play.
Kent Lee Platt is an interesting guy. That's the guy that Raz. He's been on the show a couple of times. And I was hoping you were going to say that because I know he's told me a couple times. Your tight end has got a low RAS score, like don't even put him on the field. It's almost that close to being a perfect tie end. Kevin, this is a little off topic, but most people know your history with Van Pelt. Did you guys ever consider doing a podcast together?
Oh, with Scott?
Yeah.
No. First of all, he didn't start his podcast until I think ESPN told him he had to do it. And I started my podcast. It's over 5 years old, and it was really out of necessity because we had been bought. We were sold. The radio station that bought us wanted Cooley off the show and wanted me to take a 40% pay cut, which I said, well, that's not happening. I'm not into either idea. And so I left until they came back and asked me to come back like 8 months later. But that was the best thing that ever happened to me. That was in 2018, the summer of 2018. And I started a podcast when really not many people were doing podcasts. And for me, it was very fortunate in that my radio audience was there for me. A lot of people that start these things from scratch, it's really hard to build an audience that's truly, has a chance to be monetized and make it worthwhile. And I got lucky in that. It's one of the luckiest things that ever happened. I'm glad I went back to radio, and I'm glad that they wanted me to come back to radio. But Scott, Scott's a TV star, man. He's a TV star. I did a bunch of radio with him in his early days of doing radio when he was doing a show with Mike Tirico. When Tirico was off doing games or whatever, I subbed in a bunch in that first year or two, but it was about a television show and you had to be in Connecticut, to do that. And I wasn't, I had the radio show here and I've got my life here. He's great. The podcast that he does with Stanford Steve is awesome. And both of those guys, as you know, are on my shows all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I knew that, but I just was curious. I think you and Al started podcasting about the same time when they made that radio switch, right?
I'm sorry?
I said, I think you and Al Galdi both made switches to podcasts because of that radio.
Al did it a couple of years later because he stuck around in radio. And when he got cut loose, I remember the conversation. I said, you have to do a podcast.
Yeah.
You have people that like listening to you and you'll love doing it. Because Galdi, he's one of my favorite people on earth. Galdi loves to sort of just be by himself and do this radio podcast. Galdi, when he was doing a radio show, he was much better solo than he was with other people. Not that he was bad with other people, he was good, but that was his preference. And I'm like, this is going to be perfect for you. And, I know he's doing well with it too, which is great.
He was on the podcast Friday and I think people are always amused to see what he looks like, because he's always just doing the audio podcast that was raised before that. But now
Galdi is, all of the guys that we spent a lot of years together with in the same, building, in the same, 1,500 square feet, 2,000 square feet, basically, with studios and everything else. Galdi, everybody loves Galdi. We all get along with Galdi, but Galdi's he's got some issues. I'll just leave it at that. They're fine. He is, he's not going to hurt anybody, but he's got some issues. Just ask, Zabe, me, Andy, Doc. We'll tell you, Galdi's got some things going on there, but I love him. He's the best.
The draft is over. Let's go back to football. The draft is over. What to you is the biggest need on the team? I guess I'd follow that up just with, we've been talking the last couple of weeks about what kind of bump to the secondary and maybe the whole defense altogether by bringing Dan Quinn?
Well, I think you start there, right? Because it's not that Jack Del Rio and Ron Rivera aren't good coaches. Like, I think our fan base has gotten a little bit crazy. I think what we had Ron Rivera doing 2 jobs, and then, oh, by the way, he got sick and he had a terrible owner and there were investigations. And then last year was a lame duck year. It ruined everything. In hindsight, last year was basically shot before it started. You had a lame duck head coach. You had new ownership. You knew there were going to be big changes at the end of the year. You had an offensive coordinator that I still can't believe that people didn't understand that nobody else wanted him. This was the only place that was hiring Eric Bieniemy, unless he was going to go back and work for Andy Reid, but he was going to be demoted because Nagy was going to get elevated. That created more dysfunction on the offensive side of the ball. I don't think we could have ever envisioned the defense being that bad. I mean, a year ago, I think we're all sitting here going, wow, they were a top 10 defense in 2022 and they'll be even better, and it was a disaster. So it starts with quarterback. But then for me, it's like, I know everybody's focused on O-line and there's a lot of needs, but the best thing that could help, there are a lot of things that could help a young quarterback. One of those things is defense. Give him more chances. Don't put him in game situations like he was at LSU where he had to score. They've done that with coaching. I think they've done that with some players, by the way, with real leadership at the linebacker spot with Bobby Wagner. Frankie Louvu was my favorite free agent signing. And we'll see what it looks like. I think there's a chance that we're going to look at guys like Payne and Allen and Forbes maybe, and maybe even somebody like Jamin Davis, and say, how did you guys have such a shitty year last year? Like, how did that happen? And because we saw what they could do in 22, at least, Duran and John. So we'll see. I mean, the defense can't be worse than it was last year. We know that.
Absolutely not. And I agree with you. I think Ron Rivera had a great start to his tenure here. I thought he was a admirable coach. I thought he was very authentic. But, they're clearly that last year he was a sitting duck and did kind of leave a bad taste in all of our mouths. But I root for him. I like Ron Rivera a lot. To that end, in regard to, we have a new regime. We have a new coach. We have a new ownership. We have a whole bunch of things coming into DC right now. What would be a successful year to you, in your opinion, Kevin? Are you looking at wins and losses? Are you looking at development of players? Are you looking at competent coaching? Like, what would be the Kevin Sheehan, this is a successful year at the end of 2024?
Jayden Daniels shows enough to convince all of us that they made the right pick.
That's a great idea. Good point. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's the most important thing. What's ironic about that is last year when they decided to go with Sam Howell, I said the most important thing about this upcoming season is that we know by the end of 17 games if we need to go get a quarterback in the draft in 2024.
Were you a Howell guy?
Or in free agency. So, I'm sorry?
Were you a Howell guy? I'm sorry. I don't know if you were.
Nah, not really.
Okay.
I think there were major limitations there, and I think there will be for him moving forward. I think he can play in the league. I think he is a solid backup quarterback. I think maybe even a low-end starter and a Gardner Minshew kind of a career, Colt McCoy kind of a career, but he wasn't the long-term answer, in my opinion. And I'm glad that we were able to determine that. It was kind of a strange experiment going into last year anyway.
Yeah, I agree.
But and so in 2024, it's about thinking that they made the right choice with Jayden Daniels, because, by the way, if we believe that, then we'll also believe in Adam Peters in the front office. And probably believe in Quinn and Kingsbury to a certain degree.
That you mentioned Kingsbury there, Kevin. I keep asking people, and I guess at this point we just won't know until we get to camp. What do you think the offense with Kingsbury, Anthony Lynn, and Ryan Johnson will ever be looked like?
I don't know, Doug. I have no idea. I'm guessing that Kingsbury, based on what we've seen during his career, what we heard him say, and the only time we've heard him speak, which was his introductory press conference where he didn't look super thrilled to be spending time talking to anybody. I think he will be open that tailors the offense around the talent that he has. And I bet you that he was one of those guys that watched Jayden Daniels and watched the tape and talked to people that had coached him and trained him and said, it's limitless if we have him on what we can do. So I would expect, a lot of, hopefully a running game where you can go play action and you can go bootleg, whether it's under center or not, preferably under center, more in a Shanahan style. But I think you'll work in a lot of dual threat with him, as a runner, whether it's, zone read or designed runs, but that won't be the primary thing for him. You don't need to do that with him. He is an advanced pocket passer, different than Lamar Jackson or RG3 when they came into the league. And so I'm looking forward to it. I don't have a really good answer for you. I kind of have a gut feel that he'll be good and creative and figure it out.
It'll be interesting because, part of the deal with Kingsbury last go round was like that hurry up, go fast, go fast. The whole league is using motion now. They use no motion because what's the killer of speed is that motion. You try to get to the line and go fast. In a league that is primarily built off of motion now, I'm curious how he will have changed since he last coached in the NFL in 2022.
I think one of the things he said, and by the way, Quinn said it too, in their introductory press conferences, that in every stop that they have, gone to from one coaching job to another, they had to evolve because the league constantly is changing. And Quinn said everybody was expecting, single high and everything we did in Seattle. And we didn't do a lot of that in Dallas. I had to change with the way the league was going. Kingsbury said the same thing about coming in here. I'm looking at what's being done now, and we're going to try to meet the challenge of what defenses have evolved into, and we've always got to answer that challenge. You always want those coaches, I guess there is something to be said for, the most physical line of scrimmage dominant teams, even if they're playing old school football. We've seen some of that in recent years with Baltimore. We saw it with Tennessee for a while, and Derrick Henry. You can there are lots of ways to skin the offensive cat, but we'll see. I don't know.
Kevin, before we get out of here, George brought some over-under props. We're curious what your thoughts are on these things.
Okay.
All right, we'll start off with the first one. Kevin, so the win-loss total by BetMGM is 6.5 wins. How do you feel about that? Go over under?
I did the over last year on whatever it was, and I
learned your lesson.
Got burned. I think if the defense improves, which it should, the whole environment will be more positive than it was last year. I don't see why they can't double their win total and be in that 7 to 8 territory. So I'll go over. Gotcha. Subject to change. We have until September.
Absolutely. Got a couple more for you. So speaking of BetMGM, they had Jayden Daniels at 3,250 passing yards. That averages to about 180 yards per game. How do you feel about that? Over under? Yeah,
we did this on the show, some of the Jayden Daniels props. I didn't have a good feel for that one way or the other. I guess, rookie passer. Stroud threw for 4,100 plus last year.
And Sam threw for like 3,900 last year, right?
Yeah, he also threw it about 800 times more than anybody else did. Let's not forget that. I don't know. I'll go over. Sure.
Gotcha. All right, let's do one or two more. So 500 rushing yards for Jayden Daniels in the year.
So the one that I saw was 4.5 rushing touchdowns.
Okay, I saw that one too. Okay.
I like over on that.
I agree.
That's the one that I picked out, and I thought, I can see a QB draw or two this year for a score in the red zone. I could see maybe, a zone read keeper. Not a lot of tush push. Philadelphia Eagles, Jalen Hurts touchdowns, but I could see him also breaking off an RG3 kind of a touchdown like he had in 2012 against the Vikings. 76 yards. So I like Lamar Jackson's first 3 years rushing touchdowns, I think, were 775 or 577. So I'll put him in that category. I'll go over 4.5 rushing touchdowns.
Gotcha. Go ahead, Doug.
Pounding the over on that one.
Absolutely.
Will the fan base be upset if he throws for 3,200 and Sam threw for 3,900 last year. Kevin,
Oh God,
are we gonna have to put up with stat chasing from the fan base?
I honestly have gotten to the point where those kinds of conversations I just try to tune out, because it would be silly. Of course, people will say that. I think by the end of the year, though, as far as Sam goes, in the same way that I think, people finally understood with Taylor, these aren't long-term answers.
Right.
I think, you have to watch the whole league, and a lot of our fans, and I'm not saying we're unique, a lot of fan bases just watch their own teams, and don't watch the rest of the league. If you watch the rest of the league, you understand Taylor Heineke and Sam Howell are not full-time starters on a sustained winning, team.
Daniels has definitely got quarterback one written all over him, doesn't he?
Let's hope. You never know, but he's got that kind of talent. And I love the swing. The swing is,
Yep.
You got to take that big swing. Even though you understand going in, historically, it probably won't work. I mean, it's terrible to say that, but that's what, it's like out of the 6 that were taken, more likely than not, 4 of them aren't really going to be that good.
I know.
So let's hope we got one of the 2.
All right, Kevin. I'd say it was good to see you again, but we'll stick with it. Was great chatting with you again.
You guys got to figure that out. I'm kidding. I don't know.
Thanks, buddy. We appreciate you.
All right, Kevin.
Guys. Thanks for having me.
All right, bye.
Yep.